They say the Emperor loves me. Oh yes, he must. Why else would he be so keen on keeping me alive just to throw me back into the meat grinder each day? I'm crouching in a trench filled with mud and blood, my hands shaking around the grip of a lost gun that's seen better days. Dawn is just a gray smear on the horizon. Any minute now, a whistle will shriek or a siren will wail, and we poor bastards will go over the top. Another glorious charge for the Emperor's light, or so they tell us. I peek over the trench lip and see the wasteland ahead, barbed wire tangles, craters of blackened earth, and the wrecks of tanks jutting like gravestones. Somewhere out there, the enemy is waiting for us, rifles trained and heavy bolters hungry. My heart thuds like a jackhammer in my chest. Fear and cold damp cling to my bones. I remind myself, for the 100th time this morning, there's no turning back. Quite literally. The explosive collar snug around my neck ensures that. If I try to run the other way, the best I can hope for is a quick, headless death instead of whatever nastiness the heretics have in store. I should probably introduce myself while I have the chance. Name's not important. Names don't last long in the Penal Legions, and I've been called every curse under the sun anyway. Some of the lads call me Lucky, half as a joke, half in envy, because I've survived a couple of these suicide missions now. Emperor knows it's not skill or courage. Honestly, I suspect it's his twisted sense of humor. Lucky, right, if being here is luck, I'd hate to see what misfortune looks like. So how did I end up in this fine situation, you ask? On paper, I'm a soldier of the Astra Militarum, Imperial Guard. To us old-timers, serving a life sentence in a penal legion. In reality, I'm cannon fodder with a serial number. Once upon a time, I was a regular guardsman with the 145th Atrian Infantry. Had a decent posting, a cot to sleep in, even a girl back home who wrote me letters. Then one day I made a mistake. A big one. I was stationed on Vorlon Fee, in the middle of a pitched battle against orcs. When my unit's flank collapsed and those green monsters overran us, I ran. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe just survival instinct, but I turned tail and fled the line. I'll spare myself the excuses. Bottom line, I deserted my post. They caught me, of course. There's no place for cowards in the Guard, and ordinarily a last bolt to the head would have been the end of my story. But the Munitorum, in its infinite mercy, decided a quick death was too easy. Instead, they shipped me off to the Penal Legion to serve in the Emperor's light until redemption or death, as the sentencing scroll read. A long-winded way of saying we'll use you until you're used up. Only in death does my duty end, and my superiors are determined to squeeze every last drop of it out of me first. I still remember arriving at the processing center on that forsaken asteroid prison. They herded a whole crowd of us condemned into a gigantic gray chamber that stank of sweat, ozone, and despair. Arbitrators, Imperial law enforcers, stood watch with shock batons and shotguns. These were not friendly lads. They had heavy black carapace armor and impassive helmets with reflective visors like metal skulls glaring back at us. Every time one of us convicts twitched or murmured, an arbitrator's shock baton would lash out with a crackling zap as a reminder to stay in line. "Welcome to the Emperor's Penal Legion, scum!" a voice boomed from an amplivisor. Up on a raised platform, a tall figure in flowing dark robes surveyed us. That was Prefect Voss, the overseer of new inmates. His voice echoed through the chamber, dripping with contempt. "You are here because you have proven yourselves unworthy of the Emperor's mercy in civilized society. You are thieves, murderers, deserters. Filth that still has one use left, to serve as weapons in the Emperor's wars. Your lives now belong to him. You will fight and you will die, And if by some miracle you do enough good before dying, perhaps your souls might be spared eternal damnation. Hell of a pep talk. I stood there in my dirty, tattered old uniform, a fresh barcode tattoo still burning on my arm from intake, and felt any last hope shrivel up. Around me, I heard a few men and women sobbing quietly, others cursing under their breath. One burly fellow near the front shouted out, "I didn't do nothing. I'm innocent!" His outburst earned him a swift response. A whip crack echoed, and the man screamed as a length of electro-scourge tore into his back. He crumpled to the floor, twitching from the current, while the rest of us looked on in terrified silence. Innocence means nothing here. We all wear the same brand now. They processed us like we were pieces of meat on a conveyor. First came the head shaving. Buzzing clippers mowed down hair and identity alike. I watched clumps of my brown hair fall to the steel floor until a mirror would have shown me looking as hairless and pitiful as a newborn. Then the branding. One by one, we stepped forward to a pair of skull-masked clerks who jabbed us with inked needles. I came away with a crudely tattooed unit insignia and number on my left temple, bright prison blue against my pale skin, a number as if I were a cog in some great machine. Perhaps I was. Only after that did we receive the lovely collars. Tech priests in oil-stained red robes scurried about, each accompanied by an arbitrator guard. I remember one of those tech priests approaching me, spidery mechadendrites coiling out from under his robes. In his skeletal augmetic hands he carried a wide steel ring lined with blinking lights, the collar. I felt a chill as he snapped it around my neck. It locked with a heavy click and a brief, high-pitched whir. Tiny needles bit into my skin for a moment as it settled. A brief hiss followed. Later I learned that was the sound of the built-in drug injectors priming themselves. "Tampering will result in detonation," droned the tech priest in a monotone as he worked. His face was mostly metal, save for one human eye that regarded me with utter disinterest. I recall the faint smell of burned incense and machine oil wafting from him. With a metallic finger, he tapped the device now hugging my throat. "Explosive charges are active. Follow all commands for your chance at redemption." That was it. No further instruction needed. We all knew that we were effectively wearing our own executioners around our necks, one press of a button by our handlers, or one step out of line and pop goes the convict. Once collared, they handed each of us a bundle of equipment. A drab gray uniform marked with convict stripes and an identification number on the breast. Stiff, itchy fabric, but at least it was cleanish. There was a pair of heavy boots that felt like lead, and a flak vest and helmet, the same kind regular guardsmen get, though I suspected these had seen a lot of previous owners. My helmet even had a bullet gouge in the side. Comforting. Along with that came the standard kit. A rucksack with a blanket, some moldy-smelling ration bars, a water canteen, a small knife, a mess tin, and an Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer booklet. Yes, they even gave us the Emperor-forsaken primer, the little book of lies and half-truths meant to inspire the troops. I shoved mine into a pocket, figuring I'd use it to wipe my backside later if we ran out of paper. The last item thrust into my hands was my new weapon, a lascarbine. Similar to the standard las gun I'd carried as a regular soldier, but shorter barrel with a battered folding stock. Lighter and easier to wield in tight spots, they say. More like they didn't trust us with full rifles. Still, a las beam from this would kill just as dead as any. I was issued 4 charge packs for it, each with just enough charge to remind me ammo is a privilege, not a right. They didn't bother giving us bayonets. Maybe they thought we'd stab each other, or ourselves, before the enemy could. As I shuffled along with my gear in my arms, I caught sight of the man in front of me, a skinny, nervous-looking youth who couldn't have been more than 20 standard years old. His head was freshly shaved like mine, revealing a lattice of old scars on his scalp. When he glanced back at me, I saw pure fear in his eyes, like a cornered animal. We ended up next to each other in the assembly that followed. That's where I met young Leif, though I'd only learn his name much later. At that moment, we were just two terrified new conscripts among hundreds. After gear issue, they marched us to the barracks, a series of cold, dimly lit prefabricated halls surrounded by plasteel fences and watchtowers. The place felt more prison than camp, which I suppose it was both. The two of us, me and the skinny kid, were shoved into the same barracks section, along with maybe 50 others. Bunk beds stacked 3 high-lined each wall, and we each got a thin, flea-infested mattress and 1 blanket. Luxury accommodations. I tossed my kit on a low bunk and sat down heavily, exhaustion from the day's ordeals catching up. The kid slid onto the bunk above mine. For a while, there was just a heavy silence as everyone settled, each lost in their own misery. Eventually, a gruff voice broke the quiet. "So what are you in for?" it growled. I looked up to see a broad, ugly brute of a man looming across the aisle. Muscles knotted his arms, and a faded gang symbol was tattooed on his neck. His eyes had a dangerous gleam, half mad dog, half opportunist, sizing up newcomers. I gave a cautious shrug. "Desertion," I said simply. No point lying. The barcode on my temple probably encoded my crimes anyway. The brute snorted. "A coward, eh? Figures. You smell like one." He leaned closer, an ugly sneer curling his lip. "I killed 3 men in a brawl. Officer tried to break it up, so I killed him too. They said I'd hang for it, but here I am. Lucky me." His breath reeked of low smoke and rot gut. I met his gaze as steadily as I could. Inside, I was shaking. This guy was clearly trying to establish some pecking order, and I was a prime target, being of average build and non-crazy. "Some luck," I managed to reply dryly. "Traded a noose for a collar." I tapped the metal ring around my neck. He blinked, not expecting a comeback. Then he barked out a laugh. "Heh, got some tongue on you. Don't worry, you stick by old Brack in a fight. Maybe you'll live a bit longer, coward." With a final glower meant to be intimidating, he moved off to harass someone else, loudly boasting about his exploits. Brack. I silently etched the name into my memory with a grimace. Every outfit has a bully or two. Brack was ours, a mix of murderer and braggart, likely to be as dangerous to his fellow convicts as to the enemy. I resolved to keep an eye on that one, and to avoid him whenever possible. After lights out, as I lay on my bunk, staring at the underside of the one above me, a whisper drifted down. "Hey, you still awake?" It was the kid above, Leif. "Yeah," I whispered back. In the dark, voices carried quietly amongst the rows of breathing bodies. A few others murmured to each other as well. No one could really sleep, not on the first night. I'm Leif," he said softly. "What's your name?" I hesitated a moment. It felt strange, almost painful, to state my name after all that had happened. But perhaps I needed to hold on to it, to remember I was still human. "Jaren," I finally replied, equally quiet. It had been a while since someone asked my name without an insult attached. "Jaren," Leif repeated. "I'm here 'cause I stole some rations on my first posting. Real stupid of me. They said it was treasonous theft of imperial property." I could hear the shame and disbelief in his voice. I never thought they'd throw me into something like this for it. Treason for a few ration bars. I shook my head in the darkness. The Imperium doesn't do half measures. "Bad luck," I murmured. "Guess they needed bodies." A shaky sigh from Leif. "Do you think any of us will make it? Get out alive one day?" I didn't answer immediately. I knew what I believed, that we were as good as dead, walking corpses that just hadn't stopped moving yet. But I didn't have the heart to crush the little hope he had left. I don't know, I lied. Maybe if we keep our heads down and do our job, some officers give out pardons for exemplary service. Even as I said it, I doubted it. I'd heard of it happening extremely rarely, 1 in a million. Above me, Leif sniffled. "Emperor protects," he muttered, as if reciting a comforting mantra. "Sure," I whispered back, though my tone was more bitter than reassuring. If the Emperor was protecting us, he had a funny way of showing it. More likely, we were beyond his notice or care, but I kept that to myself. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. That night, I dreamed of Vorla and Vi, the screams of dying comrades, the roar of orcs, and the burning shame of my own cowardice. In the dream, I was running again, my legs leaden, the sound of a commissar's bolt pistol ringing out behind me. I jolted awake in a cold sweat, half expecting to find half my head gone. But I was still alive, staring at the metal wall of the barracks and hearing the distant clang of a morning bell. Morning on the penal world came with barked orders and boots on our backsides. Literally. An arbitrator stormed through the aisle, slamming his boot into any sleeping form until we all scrambled up, bleary-eyed. "Rise and shine, sinners! Time for your blessed service!" he shouted, voice muffled by his helmet's vox. We stumbled into formation outside the barracks in the chill air. The sky above was a dull, dirty gray. You could never tell the time of day properly under the ash clouds. A cadre of arbitrators with shock mauls prowled around us, and behind them loomed a towering preacher draped in threadbare ecclesiarchy robes. He had bionic eyes that glowed red and a massive tome chained to his belt. His breath puffed out steam as he eyed our assembly. When he opened his mouth, it was as if a thunderclap had descended. "Sinners of the Emperor's legions penitent," he bellowed, voice remarkably loud without any amplifier. "Hear me, I am Father Shon, your guide on the path of atonement." Some of us stood shivering, others stared defiantly or blankly. The preacher paced before us like an angered lion. "It is through your toil and blood that you shall seek redemption," he cried. "You have transgressed against the God Emperor, but he, in his infinite mercy, offers you this chance, this one final chance to earn forgiveness through sacrifice. Every enemy you slay in his name absolves a fraction of your sins. Every drop of your blood spilled is a step toward purifying your soul. You are the damned given one last chance at salvation. Embrace it, for death in his service is the only death with meaning left to you." His fervor was almost mesmerizing. I found myself hanging on his words despite my skepticism. There's a certain power in the way these priests speak, the conviction behind it that can stir even the most jaded heart. Around me, I saw some convicts unconsciously nodding or standing a bit straighter. Even Leif, beside me, had a determined set to his jaw now, clinging to the promise that we could earn forgiveness. Brock, I noticed, stood with arms crossed and a sneer. He muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Get on with it, you two-faced windbag." Fortunately, the arbitrators didn't catch that remark, or he might have lost his tongue. Father Scholn raised a leather-bound copy of the Imperial Creed in one hand. "Pray with me, lost souls. Pray for the Emperor's grace in battle, that you may die with his name on your lips and not curses. Repeat after me. The Emperor's light will guide me. Through blood and fire I shall repay my debt." A chorus of uncertain voices followed, including my own mumble. Better to play along. The arbitrators were watching. "The Emperor's light will guide me. Through blood and fire I shall repay my debt," we repeated. Satisfied, the preacher stepped back, making the sign of the Aquila across his chest. Go forth and fight, and know that the God Emperor watches over your immortal soul, if not your wretched lives. Charming last line. Father Sean turned and marched off, presumably to rouse and rally the next batch of sinners elsewhere. With that morning ritual done, the prefect himself, Prefect Voss, came striding out before us, accompanied by several arbitrator officers. In daylight, I could see him more clearly than during intake. He was tall and imposing, wearing a uniform that was part officer's coat and part judge's attire. A white sash across his chest marked him as Prefect Penitente, basically the head warden of our legion. His eyes were cold, his jaw set in permanent disapproval. "You!" He pointed at one of the men in the front rank abruptly. It was the poor fellow who had cried innocence yesterday and gotten whipped. The man flinched, a bandage crudely slapped over his lashed back. "Step forward," Voss demanded. Trembling, the man stepped out. Without warning, Voss drew his sidearm, a bolt pistol, and shot the man in the head. A deafening crack and a splash of red mist, and the unfortunate soul collapsed, headless, before us. A few convicts cried out in shock. I just stood there, heart pounding. Emperor's mercy. Prefect Voss returned the smoking pistol to his holster calmly. "Innocence proves nothing," he stated, voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You are guilty, all of you. Guilt is the one truth you carry, and only through service can you attempt to balance the scales. Fail to serve, and this," he gestured to the corpse leaking onto the dirt, "will be your fate. Succeed, and you get to fight another day." I swallowed hard, bile rising in my throat. So much for second chances. He just executed that man as an example. Nothing more. The arbitrators dragged the body away, leaving a dark stain on the ground. "Report to your section leaders for assignment," an officer barked. The formation broke up briskly. No one wanted to be the slow straggler after that display. Leaf and I exchanged a glance. His face was pale. I'm sure mine was too. Without a word, we shuffled to where a cluster of other convicts were gathering around a stocky arbitrator sergeant consulting a data slate. The arbitrator sergeant wore a different uniform than the black-armored goons. His was white and gray, with a high-collared flak vest and a badge of office. The white was apparently to distinguish him as pure compared to us, the way a butcher wears an apron to separate himself from the blood of animals. He scanned our faces with a permanent scowl. "Listen up, animals," he began, voice scratchy and mean. "I am Arbitrator Sergeant Hark. I will command your squad. You will address me as Sir or Sergeant Hark. You will obey my every order without hesitation. You will eat, sleep, piss, and fight when I tell you to. Step out of line, and I'll put you down myself, or call in a caller detonation. Are we clear?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," answered him. Some muttered, some louder. Braxi's voice was one of the loudest. If he was going to play the game, he'd want to seem compliant in front of the bosses. Hark continued. "We depart this rock tomorrow. You scum have been assigned to the 223rd Penal Battalion, destined for the front lines on planet Verdant Prime. There's a rebellion brewing there, and we're going to help put it down the hard way. Lucky you." He smirked in a way that suggested he thought the opposite. "Today you'll get a brief training refresher and then loaded onto the transport shuttles. Try not to die before we even leave, eh? Verdant Prime." I'd never heard of it, but the name conjured an image of green fields and forests, sounded almost pleasant, though I was sure reality would differ. A rebellion, he said. Could be a secessionist uprising, planetary governor gone rogue, or chaos cultists. Though if it were chaos, they might have mentioned it. Maybe not. They didn't like to scare us more than necessary. In truth, it didn't matter. An enemy of the Imperium is an enemy we had to shoot, whoever they were. The training refresher turned out to be a joke. They marched our squad, along with a few others, out to a firing range near the prison walls. There, each of us got to fire precisely 5 shots from our lascarbines at some rusty target drones. Hawk watched like a hawk, maybe to ensure none of us tried anything stupid with a loaded weapon. A couple of the convicts clearly had never handled a gun before. Their shots went wild. One man accidentally discharged into the ground a meter in front of him. Hawk strode over and smashed the butt of his shotgun across the offender's face, sending teeth flying. "You flag yourself or your mates again. I'll assume you were trying to commit suicide and save you the trouble," he snarled. So it went. We drilled at basic squad movements for maybe an hour. Advance, cover, fall back. Just enough to hope we wouldn't trip over each other in battle. Honestly, it was pathetic. As a former guardsman, I found myself automatically executing the maneuvers with what muscle memory I had. But some of these prisoners, Emperor help us. Still, Hawk seemed to think brute motivation would make up for lack of skill. "You lot will have plenty of live fire training soon enough," he said with a wolfish grin. "Nothing like incoming fire to straighten out sloppy technique." By midday, we were loading onto the orbit-bound shuttles that would take us to whatever transport ship was assigned. It was a chaotic herd, hundreds of us in rattling metal tin cans with engines. No windows, of course. I ended up squeezed shoulder to shoulder on a bench between Leaf and a silent older convict with cybernetic implants on half his face. As the shuttle engines roared and gravity pressed us into our seats, Leaf murmured a prayer under his breath. Across from us, Brack was cracking his knuckles nonchalantly, as if the shuttle ride bored him. Me, I just closed my eyes and tried not to think about what awaited on Verdant Prime. My mind drifted to that little Imperial primer booklet in my pocket. Out of idle curiosity, and to distract myself from takeoff, I fished it out and flipped through a few pages in the dim interior light. The primer was as absurd as I remembered. One section declared, "In his glorious service, the Astra Militarum finds truth. A guardsman's life is a small price for victory. Fear not the alien or the traitor. They are weak of mind and will break before the steadfast courage of the Emperor's faithful." I almost snorted aloud. Weak of mind? Break before our courage? Whoever wrote this had never actually gone up against a charging orc horde or a heretic in the throes of chaos-fueled frenzy. According to the primer's appendix on enemy capabilities, the average casualty rate expected when facing a traitor rebellion was listed as acceptable, 17.8%. Emperor protects. What a joke. I showed that to Leaf, nudging him with my elbow. "Hear that, kid? Only about 18% of us will die facing rebels. Could be worse." He gave a wan smile. "That doesn't sound so bad, really." I shook my head. "Don't believe it. Those numbers are Dren-fed nonsense. Best to assume they mean 80%, not 18. I tossed the primer back in my pack. "Save the rest of that for when you need a fire starter." The older convict with the cybernetic face overheard and chuckled dryly. "Primer says what they want you to believe, not what is. Trust me, been in 3 suppressions before they finally collared me. Always bloodier than the books say." 3 suppressions. So this guy was a veteran of combat, or perhaps penal service already. I looked at him curiously. "How'd you manage to last that long?" He tapped the metal half of his face. "Didn't entirely, but I keep on ticking." That was all he said, falling silent again. The shuttle jerked as it docked with a larger ship. Soon enough, we were marched in tight formation through echoing steel corridors onto the troop decks of a Navy transport vessel. The air was cold, recycled, carrying that familiar tang of promethium and machine oil found on all void ships. Brief flicker of memory hit me, boarding a transport on a previous deployment as a normal guardsman, full of camaraderie and at least a veneer of dignity. This was entirely different. Here we were, a chain gang escorted by armed guards, funneled into a holding bay converted into a cage. That's where we spent the warp transit, locked in a massive cell with a few hundred of our dear fellow Penal Legionnaires. They didn't bother giving us bunks. We slept on the steel floor or not at all. At least they gave us nutrient gruel twice a day to keep us alive. The lights were kept dim and time lost meaning. In that darkness, people change. I witnessed fights break out over scraps of food or perceived slights. The arbitrators would intervene with shock prods through the bars, or sometimes they'd just let the convicts beat each other bloody if it didn't look fatal. I kept my head down, stayed close to Leif. The kid had clung to me like a lifeline, and tried to stay out of trouble. Brock and his ilk prowled the cage, occasionally throwing a punch into someone to amuse themselves or to settle an old score from prison. I once awoke to the sound of muffled screams. In a far corner, by the faint glow of emergency lumens, I saw two men crouched over a third, doing Emperor knows what to him. The next morning, that third man was found dead, choked to death. No one confessed and no investigation was forthcoming. Just one fewer mouth for the quartermaster to feed. It was a hellish limbo. I lost track of days. Warp travel does that, stretching and twisting one's sense of time. At times, I felt an itch under my skin, a sure sign that we were in the immaterium's grasp. Some of the others must have felt it too. Nightmares and night terrors were common. One unfortunate soul woke up shrieking, claiming a demon was watching him from the shadows. He wouldn't stop raving. The arbitrators dragged him out. We heard a single gunshot outside the cell. Then they returned without him. "Psyker nonsense," one guard muttered. "If any of the rest of you start seeing demons, keep it to yourselves unless you want an airlock ride." Through it all, Father Schoen, or one of his junior preachers, would periodically walk the aisle outside our cage, reciting prayers and litanies. Some convicts joined in weakly, others ignored them. I oscillated between cynicism and desperate hope. It was hard not to listen when the alternative was the maddening hum of the warp engines. So I found myself murmuring the litany of forgiveness, along with others one sleepless cycle, half meaning it. If nothing else, it was a distraction from my own thoughts. Leif took to the prayers earnestly. He said it helped him not be afraid, knowing the Emperor might pardon him if he did well. I envied him that faith. For me, the Emperor had become an abstract concept, a distant figure on Terra, far removed from my suffering. Perhaps that would change if I could ever truly do something worthy. Eventually, after what felt like weeks but could have been just days, there was a jolt and shudder through the ship. The lights brightened, and a Vox caster blared an announcement. We had translated back to real space. Soon after, we were mustered out of the cell, blinking like moles at the sudden flood of illumination and the barked commands to form up. Verdant Prime lay ahead. We made planetfall in drop shuttles under cover of darkness, the pilots taking evasive maneuvers as anti-aircraft tracers clawed at us. When the ramp dropped, the penal battalion spilled out onto soil that was not quite as verdant as the planet's name implied. There was green somewhere far off, perhaps, but here everything was churned to filthy brown mud by weeks of war. They rushed us straight to the forward trenches with little ceremony. There was a rebel defensive line that needed storming by sunrise. That's how I came to be here, in a shallow trench cut by loyalist forces, maybe a kilometer from the rebel positions. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could just make out the ominous silhouette of a ruined manufactorum complex ahead, our objective. The traitors had entrenched themselves in front of it with barbed wire, sandbags, and firing pits. We were to charge across open ground and overrun them. A simple plan, simple and suicidal. I checked my last gun for the 10th time, reseating the charge pack and tapping the power cell indicator. Half full. I muttered a curse and glanced to my side. Leaf was next to me, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes alight with a grim determination. On his other side crouched Brock, flexing his fingers around a stolen trench knife and grinning like this was all a big game about to start. Ahead of us, Arbitrator Sergeant Hawk paced along the trench, shouting final orders. In the eerie quiet before battle, his voice carried clearly. "Keep your damned heads down until the signal. When you hear the whistle, you get up and you run at the enemy. You do not stop. You do not turn back." He pointed a gloved finger at us in warning. "Anyone who falters will wish they'd been shot. The Emperor is watching, and so am I." I swallowed, pressing my back against the mud wall. My heart hammered so loud I swore everyone could hear it. I rubbed a thumb nervously over the activation stud of a frag grenade at my belt to ensure it was secure. My mouth was bone dry despite the damp air. Next to me, Leaf was whispering something. I leaned closer and realized he was reciting a prayer under his breath. "Though I walk in shadow, I shall fear no evil. The Emperor's light is my shield." His hands shook around his last gun, but he kept murmuring. Brock let out a low chuckle at that. "Better pray the Emperor gives you wings, boy, so you can fly over those bullets," he sneered quietly. I shot Brock a warning look. The last thing we needed was infighting now. Thankfully, he just snorted and returned to psyching himself up, slapping the side of his head with his palm. I took a deep breath, inhaling the bitter scent of damp earth and my own cold sweat. Down the line, I saw Father Scholm, the preacher, moving along, giving blessings to the departing souls we essentially were. He raised his Aquila pendant high. "The Emperor's gaze is upon you, and his judgment is at hand," Scholm intoned. "Fight true, and your sins may be forgiven in death. Die with his name on your lips." He stopped above our little huddle and made the sign of the Aquila. Leif eagerly mirrored the gesture across his chest. I gave a feeble half motion, more out of habit than conviction. The preacher's bionic eyes whirred as they focused on me. "Have faith, son. The Emperor redeems all if your heart is true," he said, oddly gentle amid the fervor. I didn't have the courage or time to contradict him. He moved on, shouting encouragement further down the trench. I clenched my teeth. Moments now. The distant crump of artillery in other sectors thudded like a heartbeat. To our right, I noticed a trio of large figures being led up to the line. Penal Legionnaires, but heavily outfitted with strange gear. Each had a bulky harness strapped to their chest, covered in explosives and tubes feeding into their necks. Their eyes looked vacant, pupils wide from combat drugs. Human bombs. I realized they'd sent some of those poor zealots with us, likely to rush the enemy lines and detonate among them. Emperor preserve us, I thought. It was one thing to face death with a gun, another to run at it with nothing but a bomb strapped to your chest. Yet these men were smiling serenely, muttering prayers with the preacher as he blessed their explosives. True fanatics or completely broken souls. Somewhere down the trench, an officer's saber flashed. A whistle blast split the air. "Go! Go! For the Emperor!" Sergeant Hawk roared. Adrenaline flooded my veins. There was no time to think, only raw instinct. I hauled myself up and over the trench lip, feet sloshing in the mud as I climbed out. Immediately, I was greeted by the deafening cracks of gunfire. The enemy trenches ahead erupted with muzzle flashes. Red last bolts and tracer rounds whizzed overhead and slammed into the ground around us, kicking up sprays of mud. I was running, legs pumping wildly. Left and right, Dozens, hundreds of my fellow prisoners were charging with me, ragged figures sprinting and stumbling. The open ground between trenches suddenly felt impossibly vast. I focused on the nearest bits of cover, a shattered ox transport wagon, a churned-up crater about halfway across, and willed myself towards them, the air filled with a banshee chorus of bullets, pings and zings of ricochets, thumps of impacts. To my left, a man let out a horrific, gargling scream and pitched face first into the mud, clutching at the stump where his arm had been. Some high-caliber round had sheared it clean off. To my right, I heard an explosion and glimpsed a fountain of dirt and limbs. Someone stepped on a landmine. The shockwave rattled my teeth. I dimly registered Leaf keeping pace with me, his face contorted in terror and determination. We both dove into a shell crater at the same moment as a swarm of heavy stubber rounds tore through the air where we'd been a split second prior. I landed hard on my side, knocking the wind out of me. Life landed beside me, panting, eyes wide. "Throne! Throne!" he gasped, using a common curse in place of the Emperor's name. A chunk of mud had splattered across his face and he was trembling all over, but unhurt. For a heartbeat, we huddled there in the crater. Over the deafening cacophony, I could hear the thud of our supporting artillery finally opening up. Late, as usual. A few incoming shells whistled overhead and erupted among the enemy lines. One shell landed close enough that we felt the ground shudder. Peeking up, I saw a section of the rebel trench vanish in a cloud of fire and debris. Dismembered bodies and burning planks rained down. "Come on," I barked at Leif, jerking my head forward. If we lingered too long, either a mortar would land on us, or the collars might trigger if our superiors thought we were cowering. My neck prickled at that thought. Leif nodded rapidly, swallowing his fear. I could see him mouth, "Emperor, protect me," before we both hauled ourselves up out of the crater and resumed the charge. My lungs burned, my legs churning through mud that in places reached my knees. Last bolts streaked past, one so close I felt the heat singe my sleeve. I returned fire on the move, raising my lascarbine and snapping off a few shots towards the enemy line, more to make myself feel better than with any real aim. The ruby bolts vanished toward a sandbag emplacement. For all I knew, I hit nothing but air. Up ahead, through the haze of smoke and early light, dark figures were resolving the enemy's forward wire and trench works. I could make out rebel soldiers in flak vests popping up to fire at us. They looked surprisingly normal at a glance, just men defending their line. But normal or not, they were cutting us to ribbons. About 50 meters out, the first ranks of our screaming Penal Legionnaires hit the enemy wire. There was a series of sharp crumps as directional mines hidden in the wire were triggered. I saw 3 men vaporize into red mist, shredded by shrapnel. Others were blown off their feet, clutching torn faces or guts. The wire itself was still intact in places, thick coils of razor strands. Somehow, Brock had gotten ahead. He was one of the first to reach the obstacle. With a guttural roar, he hurled himself bodily onto the strands of wire, using his bulk as a makeshift carpet. His exposed arms and cheek shredded against the razors, but in his bloodlust or madness, he didn't seem to care. "Come on, over me!" he bellowed. Astonishingly, a couple of convicts did just that, stepping on Brock's back as he lay in the wire, using him as a bridge. One after another, men stumbled over the crushed wire and leapt into the enemy trench beyond. I saw Brock push himself up then, barbed wire trailing from his uniform, blood streaming from dozens of cuts. He ripped a strand free with his bare hands and charged forward with a manic howl, vanishing from my sight as he dropped into the trench. By the time Leaf and I reached the wire, enough bodies had piled on it, some dead, some still writhing, that it scarcely mattered where we stepped. The 2 human bombs had done their work too, One had evidently made it to the wire and blown himself, blasting a gap in the barricade and probably taking a chunk of the enemy trench with him. A smoking crater marked the spot, and bits of what might have been that zealot were splattered around it. We scrambled through the mangled gap. An enemy soldier suddenly rose up from behind a dirt berm barely 10 paces away, leveling his rifle at me. He was a bearded man in ragged PDF fatigues, eyes wild with fear or fanaticism. I couldn't tell. I was still bringing my last gun to bear when a last bolt from my left hit the rebel square in the chest. He spasmed and dropped, his uniform charred and smoking. Leif had fired. The kid stared at the fallen rebel, last gun shaking in his grip. It might have been the first man he'd ever shot. "Good shot!" I shouted hoarsely, clapping him on the shoulder. But there was no time for any more. We jumped down into the enemy trench where Brock and a few others had already gone. The scene in the trench was pure, hand-to-hand pandemonium. It was a narrow, zigzagging ditch reinforced with sandbags and sheet metal. The moment I hit the duckboards at the bottom, a rebel with a bayonet lunged at me from the side. I yelped and twisted aside. The blade skittered off my flak vest. Before he could recover, I drove forward and slammed the butt of my las gun into his face as hard as I could. There was a crunch, his nose collapsing, and he fell backward. I followed up almost instinctively, stomping down on his throat. I felt something give way, and he gurgled, eyes bulging. Just like that, I had killed a man up close. There was no time to reflect on it. His comrade was coming at me not 2 seconds later. This one swung the stock of his rifle like a club at my head. I ducked. The blow glanced off my helmet, making my ears ring. I staggered, but a last shot from behind me caught the rebel in the neck, dropping him. Leif again, covering my back. Emperor bless that boy. Brock was a few meters down the line, engaged in a gruesome brawl with 2 enemies. He had dropped his last carbine and was swinging an entrenching shovel with murderous force. I saw him crack one rebel's skull wide open with the edge of the shovel, blood spraying the trench wall. The second tried to flee down a communication trench, but Brock grabbed him by the collar and slammed him repeatedly against the wall with a primal roar. He then proceeded to stab the man in the belly with a jagged combat knife over and over, even long after the rebel stopped moving. Brock was lost to bloodlust, laughing as he mutilated the corpse. It turned my stomach, but it also probably saved some of us. His sheer ferocity was terrifying the rebels near him. All along the trench, Penal Legionnaires were overwhelming the defenders by sheer viciousness and numbers. The rebels had not expected such violent madmen to come pouring in. For once, our disgraceful status was an advantage. We fought like cornered rats because we were. I pressed forward with Leif, pushing through the trench. We encountered another knot of resistance around a heavy stubber nest. 2 rebels manned the gun, firing point-blank down the trench at incoming convicts and cutting them apart. 3 bodies already littered the approach, smoking holes punched through them by .50 caliber rounds. The muzzle flash lit the dim trench in staccato bursts. Hawk, our arbitrator sergeant, was pinned just around the corner from the nest, along with a couple of our guys. He saw me and Leif and shouted, "Grenade! Throw a grenade in there, now!" while he blind-fired his shotgun toward the nest to keep the gunners back. My heart pounded. I yanked a frag grenade off my belt, thumbed the pin out and counted 1 second, then flung it around the bend toward the muzzle flashes. "Frag out," I warned, ducking back. We all pressed to the trench floor, covering our heads. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, a blast of heat and shrapnel roaring past us. I felt a sting in my left arm as a shard nicked me, but adrenaline masked the pain. Harkey was already up and moving. We rounded the corner and found the heavy stubber position torn apart. One gunner lay in pieces, the other was slumped against the sandbags, screaming as he clutched what remained of his leg. Without hesitation, Hawk raised his shotgun and ended the man's misery with a thunderous blast. The arbitrator then kicked aside the mangled stubber. "Good throw," he grunted at me curtly. Probably the closest I'd get to a compliment. Within minutes that felt like hours, the first line of trenches was ours. A few pockets of resistance still popped shots from dugouts or bunkers, but systematically our squads cleared them with grenades or close combat. I personally shot a rebel who was feigning death and tried to stab one of our guys as we passed. That lasbolt was the first time I consciously aimed to kill someone. There wasn't any time to dwell on it. He was the enemy, and it was him or us. I clambered out of the trench to see the broader situation. The gray morning sky was streaked with black smoke now. Burning promethium from wrecked weapons pits filled the air with an acrid smell. Corpses were everywhere, drab-uniformed rebels and convicts in their prison grays intermingled in death. The mud had become a slick of blood and rainwater in many places. It was hard to find a patch of ground that wasn't littered with the fallen or the debris of war. We had taken staggering losses. Behind our newly captured line, the no-man's land was carpeted with still bodies. Some twitched or cried out. A few wounded were crawling back toward our old trench, where I now saw Medicaid personnel and perhaps some regular guard units moving to assist. Lucky them, coming in when the job was done. But we'd done it. Emperor help us, we'd actually done it. Against all expectations and possibly sanity, the Penal Legion had charged headlong into the teeth of enemy fire and overrun the rebels' front defense. I couldn't quite believe I was still alive. As that realization sank in, I felt a wave of giddy relief and nauseating guilt all at once. Relief to be breathing. Guilt because so many others around me weren't. Leif climbed up beside me, limping slightly. I saw he had a gash along his thigh, oozing blood where a fragment or stray shot had grazed him. "You all right?" I asked, putting a hand on his shoulder. He nodded, face pale. "It's just a scratch, I think. Emperor, we made it." We actually made it. There was disbelief in his voice and a note of something like pride. The kid had acquitted himself well. He'd saved my hide at least twice, and possibly others. And he was alive. That felt like a small miracle. Brock emerged from the trench a short distance away, drenched in blood that was mostly not his. He was shouting in triumph, raising his gore-slick shovel in the air. "Ha ha 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 ha! That all you got, you fracking traitors!" he bellowed at the smoking horizon, like a gladiator howling for more opponents. He was a sight to behold, clothes torn, multiple lacerations crisscrossing his arms and face, but seemingly unfazed by pain. There was a ragged hole in his left ear where a bullet had clipped it. If anything, the carnage had only energized him. Hawk and a few other arbitrators were already barking orders to reorganize. "Squad, form up, check ammunition, tend wounds quickly. We advance to the next objective in 10 minutes. The next objective? Emperor, they weren't even letting us rest. I shouldn't have been surprised. I slumped against the parapet for a moment and slid down to sit on the ground. My hands were shaking violently now that the adrenaline ebb was starting. Leif sank down next to me. "Jaren, we survived," he whispered, almost as if afraid saying it out loud would jinx it. I nodded, managing a faint smile. "So it seems. Emperor must have been looking out for you after all," I said, half sincere, half teasing. Leif closed his eyes and let out a shuddering breath. "I was so scared. I shot those men." His voice wavered. Now that immediate danger was gone, the realization of taking lives was hitting him. "You did what you had to," I said quietly, a generic platitude but true. "If you hadn't, I'd be dead. And so would you. Save your pity for later if there's any room for it. I wasn't trying to be harsh, but I needed him functional. He wiped his face with the dirty sleeve, smearing mud and tears. Then he nodded. Right. He took a deep breath. I'll be fine. I hoped so, because the day was just beginning. No sooner had we gathered ourselves than our dear Prefect Voss arrived on the scene, escorted by a cadre of bodyguards. The tall, robed figure of our beloved taskmaster stepped gingerly over the corpses strewn about, looking thoroughly unimpressed. It seemed he had been observing from a safer rear position and chose now to inspect the aftermath. Hark called us to attention, what little of the squad was left. Out of the original 50 or so in our section, maybe 20 stood now, many of those sporting wounds. We assembled in ragged rows, still catching our breath, as Prefect Voss walked along with a sour expression. Well done, my legionnaires, Voss said as he passed, though his tone was icy. You acquitted yourselves adequately. He paused near us. I saw his lip curl as he beheld our battered state. Well done, Voss repeated, voice dripping with disdain. This is a pathetic showing. Casualties are exorbitant. Half of you imbeciles died to take one trivial trench line. He spat on the ground. If I had my way, I'd flog each of you for such incompetence. I felt a hot flash of anger in my chest. How dare he? We had just done the impossible at their command, but I shoved the feeling down. Any sign of defiance now would be fatal. Hark cleared his throat nervously. Sir, the enemy positions were heavily fortified. Voss held up a hand to silence him. Spare me. Excuses are the luxury of the living, Sergeant. His cold gaze swept over us. Perhaps we need to reinforce the lesson that failure and hesitation will not be tolerated. He nodded to one of his arbitrator officers, who stepped forward holding a data pad. Voss continued in a casual tone. The following individuals were observed showing cowardice, diving for cover too soon, hanging back instead of pressing the attack. He gestured to the officer, who read off several prisoner numbers and names. My blood went icy. Were they going to? Yes, I realized with dawning horror, they were. Those whose names were called, step forward, Voss ordered. A handful of shell-shocked men obeyed slowly, exchanging apprehensive glances. Some limped from injuries. One man, bleeding from a scalp wound, protested weakly. Sir, I wasn't cowardly, I only… Silence, Voss snapped. You will make fine examples. I bit my tongue, clenching my fists. This was monstrous. These people had fought and bled, and now, because they hadn't sprinted to his liking, even Brack looked uneasy, his earlier bravado dimming as he realized what was about to happen. The chosen examples were lined up before us. There were 6 of them. A few began to beg or cry, while others simply stared in numb resignation. Prefect Voss drew his bolt pistol with a flourish. Decimation, gentlemen, he said to us almost as a lecture. 1 in 10 as punishment for any wavering. Let it remind you all that a slow advance is unacceptable. We had maybe 60 survivors in the broader company here, so he had picked 6 to roughly meet that cruel arithmetic. Before anyone could say another word, Voss raised the pistol and fired methodically down the line. Boom! One convict's chest exploded, flinging him backward. Boom! The next had his head blown apart like a ripe fruit. Boom! A smoking crater replaced the third man's torso. Each shot was deafening in the still morning air. Each victim crumpled instantly, lifeless. Their hard-won survival ended at the whim of this monster. Some of us flinched or looked away. Leif let out a soft sob beside me. I stood rigid, nails digging into my palms, shaking with fury but utterly powerless. My heart pounded with the same sick rhythm as those executions. In seconds, it was over. 6 men lay dead or dying, executed by our own side. The prefect holstered his sidearm, calm as if he'd just swatted flies. "Clean that up," he said flatly to Hark and the arbitrators, nodding at the bodies. Then, without even a direct glance at us, he turned and strode away to wherever his command post was, his retinue following like obedient hounds. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant rumble of battle continuing elsewhere on the front and the moans of a few wounded in the distance. Hawk looked pale beneath the brim of his helmet. He cleared his throat. "You heard the prefect," he barked, voice a bit strained. "We move out at once. Grab ammo from the dead, take a swig if you need it, and form up." Quietly, we set about our grim tasks. I helped Leif to his feet. He was shaking badly, eyes unfocused. "Leif, stay with me," I urged, steadying him. "They killed our own," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "Why? We did what they asked. We did it." "Because they can," I muttered bitterly. There was no satisfying answer to give, only the truth of the Imperium's brutality. "Listen, just focus now. We have to survive the next fight, understand? Anger later. Survive now." My voice was firm but low. He nodded weakly, swiping at his face. "Oh, okay." Around us, survivors were reloading weapons, taking whatever useful gear they could from fallen comrades or foes. I seized a couple of spare lasgun charge packs from a dead rebel's pouch. Power cells were universal enough. One of the executed men had a full canteen that I took, giving Leif and myself each a gulp of water to wash the dryness from our throats. It tasted of iron, probably contaminated by blood spray, but we drank anyway. Brock found a pouch of Elho sticks on a corpse and promptly lit one with a shaking hand. He inhaled deeply, bloodied chest heaving, then let out a cloud of smoke. His expression was darker than before. Even that psychopath seemed rattled by the prefect's casual slaughter. Our eyes met for a second. There was no taunt or anger in them this time, just a grim acknowledgement of shared outrage. For a fleeting moment, we both understood each other. We were nothing to our masters, and any one of us could be next. As dusk began to settle over the war-torn city, our advance finally ground to a halt. We had pushed far into Ardent Square, but the rebel defenses stiffened as we neared the city center. Distant firefights still crackled in other quarters, but our portion of the offensive was ordered to pause for the night. The guard commanders, perhaps wary of leading exhausted troops into an unknown fortified plaza in darkness, decided to consolidate positions and resume the attack at first light. We were instructed to dig in and hold what we had taken. In the rubble-strewn courtyard of an administratum building, a few of us collapsed behind a wall to catch our breath. The adrenaline of combat ebbed, leaving behind gnawing fatigue and throbbing pain from 100 minor injuries I hadn't even noticed in the heat of the moment. My legs felt like lead, every muscle trembling with overexertion. Leif slumped down next to me, sliding his back against the wall until he was sitting. He winced, hand going to the bandaged gash on his thigh. A medic had run a quick splice of synth skin over the wound earlier, but it still bled sluggishly through. "How you holding up?" I asked him quietly. He managed a tired smile. "I'm alive. That's something." His face was gaunt with exhaustion and grime, but there was a flicker of pride, too. "We did well today, didn't we?" I nodded, staring out at the dark silhouette of the cathedral spires, visible a few blocks away. Occasional tracers arced into the night sky, and the horizon glowed with burning districts. But here on our street it was relatively quiet. Aye, we're still here. That counts as well. All around, our comrades settled into defensive positions or makeshift camps among the ruins. Some munched on ration bars or took swigs from canteens. A few shared contraband LO sticks. The day's toll was evident in the drawn faces and the empty spaces where friends had been that morning. Brock was a few meters off, pacing restlessly rather than resting. The big man seemed unable or unwilling to sit still. He finally planted himself on a pile of rubble and began cleaning blood off that serrated knife of his. In the dim light, his many cuts and bruises gave him the look of a patchwork corpse, but he didn't seem to feel any of it. One by one, I saw convicts lying down where they could, desperate for a moment's sleep even on the cold concrete. Every now and then, an artillery rumble or far-off explosion would make someone jolt awake nervously, but pure exhaustion was winning out over fear for many. I realized with some surprise that I too was still clutching my last gun in a death grip. My knuckles were white around it. I exhaled and forced myself to relax, setting the weapon across my lap. I allowed myself to slide down into a sitting position like Leaf. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. We just listened to the crackle of distant fires and the occasional murmur of others in the night. I felt an odd calm settle over me, perhaps the eye of the storm, knowing another onslaught awaited at dawn, but for now we had survived this far. Leif broke the silence, voice low. "Jaren, earlier today when that prefect shot those men." He trailed off, but I knew what haunted him. "I know," I replied softly. The memory of the summary executions was still fresh and raw. 6 lives snuffed out not by the enemy, but by our own. Leif shook his head, staring at the ground. "I was so angry. I still am. They gave everything, and he just—" He clenched a fist, unable to find words. "He's a bastard," I agreed. "The worst kind of tyrant, but he's not here right now. Hawk is, and whatever else Hawk is, at least he's in the thick with us. That prefect will get what's coming to him one day, throne willing." Leif just sighed. "If we live to see it." There was no guarantee of that, certainly. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew something I'd been keeping safe, a folded, creased piece of parchment. I hesitated, then opened it gently. By the starlight filtering through a shattered rooftop, I could just make out the faded ink handwriting. It was a letter, the last one I'd received from Mara, my girl back home, before everything went wrong. I had read it countless times, so even in near dark I knew the words. The way she scolded me to stay safe, how she baked a cake for her little brother and wished I could have had a slice. How proud she was that I was serving the Emperor with honor. My throat tightened at that line. If only she knew what I had become. Leif glanced over, curious. "What's that?" "A letter," I murmured. My voice caught, and I cleared it. "From someone I cared about, back on Atrios Prime, where I'm from. She wrote me when I was still a proper guardsman." He gave me a small, sad smile. "She sounds nice." "The nicest," I agreed quietly. For a moment I let myself drift in the memory of Mara's smile, the smell of fresh recaf in her kitchen, the warmth of her embrace the day before I shipped out to war. I'd carried this letter through countless battlefields, through my disgrace and imprisonment. Why? Perhaps to remind me that once I was loved. Once I had something pure in my life. Leif shifted, leaning his head back against the wall. "Do you think, if we survive this, will we get to go home?" I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe, if we do something extraordinary enough." In truth, I doubted it. Most of us would never see home again, one way or another. But I couldn't crush that glimmer in his voice. He nodded slowly, accepting my non-committal answer. "If I go home," he said after a moment, "I'd ask forgiveness from my ma. The day they took me for stealing, I spat at the enforcers and shouted that I didn't care what happened. It was a lie, I was just scared. My ma cried so much when they dragged me away. His voice quivered. I'd want to tell her I'm sorry, that I tried to make it right here at the end. I listened quietly. In the darkness, confessions came easier. Perhaps we both felt that need to unload the weight of guilt in case the morning never came for us. You will make it right, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my tone. You already have. You fought bravely today, saved lives. The Emperor sees that. Life offered me a grateful half-smile. What about you? Any family waiting for you? My instinct was to dismiss the question, but here in the stillness I found myself answering softly. My father died in the mines when I was little. My mother, I have no idea if she's still alive. We weren't close. I left for the Guard young. Mara was the closest thing to family I had. I paused, then admitted, if by some miracle I survive this war, I don't think I could face her. Not after everything. Not with what these eyes have seen and done. You're not the same man as when you left, Leaf said, and it was unclear if he meant it positively or negatively. Probably both. None of us are. I let out a long breath. True enough. Around us, most had bedded down as best they could. Harkey had posted a few sentries, likely with strict instructions not to nod off. The arbitrator himself was murmuring into his Vox bead, probably reporting our status up the chain, or receiving orders for tomorrow. In the ruins across the courtyard, I saw a figure moving, one of the convicts who had panicked in the trenches earlier, and run. The man was skulking in shadows, perhaps contemplating deserting entirely under cover of night. I tensed, instinctively feeling for the grip of my las gun. If he bolted, he wouldn't get far anyway. There were guard pickets and kill teams out there that would shoot anything not identified. And if Hark caught wind, the poor fool's collar would detonate in a flash. But the man didn't run. He simply slunk back into the darkness, maybe deciding his odds were marginally better with us than stumbling alone through a war-torn city. I pitied him. Fear had broken him utterly. We should try to sleep, I said to Leaf. Even a little. Tomorrow's going to be rough. He agreed, and we settled in. I folded my arms across my chest, the hard wall against my back. The cold was biting, but I was too tired to care. As I drifted off, I mouthed a silent prayer, half forgotten from childhood. It wasn't to the Emperor of the Preachers, not exactly. It was to the Emperor of my heart, the way I imagined him when I was a boy. A protective figure who watched over the lost. I prayed for Mara, that she'd be happy and never know what became of me. I prayed for my soul, that if I died, it might mean something. And I prayed for the courage to see this through, to do one thing right in the end. Sleep came, fitful and dark. Some hours later, I was jolted awake by a hand on my shoulder. I snapped upright, instinctively grabbing for a weapon. Easy now, Arbitrator Hark's voice whispered. The helmeted man stood over me, silhouetted against the gray pre-dawn sky. Time to get up, trooper. We move at first light. I rubbed my eyes, nodding. Around me, others were stirring too, wincing and groaning as stiff limbs protested. Leaf blinked awake beside me, offering a bleary nod as I gently nudged him. Within minutes, we were assembled and gearing up for the final push. A final tally was taken. Our penal battalion could barely form 2 companies now, but we were supplemented by fresh-faced infantry from a reserve regiment who'd moved in overnight. Those regular guardsmen looked at us with a mix of curiosity and distaste, our savage reputation preceding us. But in the face of what lay ahead, they kept their thoughts to themselves. Bayonets were fixed, grenades redistributed, ammo checked and double-checked. The nervous energy in the air was palpable. Some convicts muttered prayers or curses under their breath. Brack cracked his neck and knuckles, eager to unleash mayhem again. I caught him giving me an ugly grin, as if to say, "One more round, coward." I just nodded at him. There was no point in trading insults now. Father Shorn limped through our ranks, bandaged but undaunted, giving quick blessings. When he came to me and Leaf, he placed a bloody hand on each of our shoulders. "The Emperor is with you, sons. Have faith that your deeds today shall wash away all sins. Fight with purity of heart." Leaf bowed his head reverently. I managed a determined nod, then the order came down the line. We were moving out. At first light on the second day, we reached a broad thoroughfare, the approach to the governor's plaza. What remained of the rebel forces had pulled back here, making a final stand around the Administratum complex and the grand cathedral of the Emperor's vision, which dominated the plaza. The cathedral's spires rose defiantly, though scarred by battle. Ironically, the traitors were using the holiest site in the city as cover. This was shaping up to be a nasty final fight. The plaza was half in ruins, littered with barricades, wrecked vehicles, and the remains of a toppled Aquila statue. Rebels scurried behind sandbags and up on the cathedral steps, armed with rifles, stubbers, possibly heavier weapons deeper in. By now, our penal battalion had merged with elements of regular guard converging on the plaza. I saw squads of flak-armored Cadian infantry and a hulking Ogren or two in the distance, taking positions on flanks. Lehman Russ battle tanks clanked up along a boulevard, their turrets swiveling to train on the cathedral. A full-scale assault was imminent. Were we actually being folded back into the main army's plans rather than thrown separately? That could be good or bad. Good because more guns alongside us means a better chance to live. Bad because they might still push the penal troops in first to soak up the most dangerous part. My money was on the latter. That's when we received new orders. Our penal company, or what was left of it, was to lead the charge straight up the plaza's center, drawing the enemy's fire and punching a hole for the other guard units to exploit. A classic meat shield maneuver. Exhausted as we were, they were sending us in yet again. Any complaints died before they could be voiced. Commissars in their black uniforms were now present, patrolling among the combined forces to ensure everyone's piety and obedience. One glare from a commissar and even Brack bit his tongue despite a string of vivid curses I saw him mouthing silently. Hark gathered those of us still under his command. Only perhaps a dozen of our original platoon remained intact enough to fight. Reinforcements from other penal squads swelled our ranks to maybe 50 for this final push, many of them fresh-caught criminals I hadn't seen before. Some looked terrified, others wore that empty, almost relieved look of men who think they won't be alive in an hour. Father Scholn appeared again, moving through our ragged line with the energy of a true zealot. "Sons and daughters of the Emperor," he boomed, voice cutting through the din. "We stand at the very doorstep of the heretics. One more effort, one more grand sacrifice, and you shall wash away the stain of your past transgressions in the blood of the traitor. Can you feel it? Absolution awaits. Only in death will your sins be forgiven. Embrace this chance. Fight, kill, die with his name on your tongue." A ragged cheer answered him, some of it earnest fervor, some just adrenaline and fatalism twisted into shouts. I found myself yelling too, caught up despite myself. Maybe it was easier to yell than to whimper in fear. Brack was pumping his fist and roaring, "Death! Death!" like a gladiator pumped for the final match. Leaf beside me simply closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer. When he opened them, he gave me a shaky smile. "Let's make it count, Jaren," he said. For once he used my name. There was something in his voice, a resolve that hadn't been there before, steadied perhaps by faith or by sheer acceptance of fate. I mustered a nod. "We'll give 'em hell," I replied, checking my last few grenade pins. I had 2 frags and 1 crack grenade remaining, plus a near-full lust pack and 1 spare. My knife was still at my side. I wiped the blood, whose I wasn't sure, off its blade with a swipe on my pant leg. The whistle blew for the 3rd time that campaign. The charge across the plaza was a blur of madness. We ran, weapons firing, voices screaming. The rebels answered with a storm of fire from the plaza and cathedral steps. Last bolts zipped through our ranks. I saw a convict to my right get hit in the gut. He spun and collapsed, trampled by those behind without pause. Mortar shells, either preset by the enemy or newly launched, began raining among us, each blast hurling dirt and limbs into the air. One went off close enough to knock me flat with a shower of grit. My ears rang as I stumbled back up, continuing forward. Explosions from our side answered. One of the Lehman Russ tanks had sighted targets and let loose its battle cannon. The shells slammed into the cathedral's front, blowing apart a section of the massive steps and sending a handful of rebels flying like rag dolls. A cheer went up from someone behind me at that sight. We reached the first line of sandbag barricades. A cluster of traitor guardsmen with a heavy stubber were set up there, spitting fire into us. Brack was ahead yet again, bellowing as he ripped the arm off a fallen enemy and used it as a grotesque club against the next foe. He had apparently lost his shovel somewhere, but it hardly slowed him. Others swarmed the position. The stubber crew were overwhelmed, stabbed and beaten to death in seconds by a mob of vengeful prisoners. The brutality was staggering. I saw one convict repeatedly smashing a rebel's head against the sandbags until nothing remained but a red smear. There was no restraint left on this field. Hawk kept us moving. "Forward, into the cathedral!" he shouted over the fray, waving us onward. The grand double doors of the structure stood ajar, one hanging broken off its hinge from the tank blast. Gunfire flickered within, close quarters fighting already as some units had breached. I bounded up the cracked stone steps. Leif was just a pace behind. As we approached the dark entrance, a rebel emerged at the doorway, wildly firing a last pistol. His shots went high. I returned fire without stopping. My lasbolt took him right under the chin. He toppled backward into the gloom. We charged into the Emperor's house, now defiled by traitors. Inside the cathedral of the Emperor's vision, the high vaulted ceilings echoed with gunfire and screams. Stained glass windows depicting saints and primarchs had been blown out, shards crunching underfoot. Wooden pews were overturned and broken, used as cover or barricades in places. The smell of incense still lingered faintly beneath the acrid tang of weapons discharge and ozone. Someone must have been burning it recently, perhaps the rebels making their own blasphemous prayers. In the nave, clusters of rebel soldiers were making a desperate last stand among the columns and shrines along the walls. Our penal troops, along with some regular guardsmen, were engaging them, using fallen masonry and the pews as cover. It was a chaotic, close-range firefight in semi-darkness, muzzle flashes casting wild shadows across frescoes of the god emperor on the high ceiling. A bolt round whizzed past my head, blowing apart a marble pillar behind me in a shower of chips. I ducked behind a chunk of fallen statue, some long-dead cardinal's likeness, now missing its head and arms, and surveyed the battle. At the far end of the cathedral, near the altar, I could make out a raised dais. There seemed to be a throng of figures up there, and strange pulsating light, reddish and unnatural, illuminating that area. A booming voice in high Gothic echoed from that direction, but I couldn't catch the words amidst the chaos. Something about powers and ascension, it sounded like. Was the rebel leader making a last proclamation? Or worse, performing some ritual? My gut clenched. Something was off. The light had a warpish hue to it, and the air felt heavy, charged. I remembered the rumors of heresy. "Emperor, please don't let it be what I think it is." Leaf slid in beside me, behind the broken statue. He had a bleeding scratch across his cheek, but was otherwise okay. Hark, Brack, and others were leapfrogging from cover to cover, pushing the rebel defenders back towards the transept of the cathedral. We joined, adding our fire. A rebel popped up from behind an upturned pew to take aim at Hark. I snapped my last gun toward him and fired first, a clean hit to the center of mass. He went down. I hoped Hark noticed that one. Not that I craved his praise, but I wouldn't mind not being on his bad side for a moment. Brack was engaged in wrestling with another traitor, both of them grappling at close quarters between two rows of shattered benches. With a snarl, Brack head-butted the man, then twisted his neck with a sickening crack. When the body fell, I saw Brack's face contorted in almost ecstatic fury, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. He seemed truly in his element. From across the dim hall, a ragged volley of autogun fire suddenly swept our way. I dropped flat as slugs tore overhead, splintering wood. One round caught a convict near me in the thigh. He howled and went down, clutching his leg. Peering out, I saw where the shots came from. A cluster of rebels by a side chapel, shielded behind a half-collapsed masonry arch. They had at least one autogun and several laguns. They were firing wildly, but in our general direction. I signaled to a Leaf, pointing at the position. Together with another convict for support, we lobbed grenades. 2 frag grenades sailed through the air in a lazy arc, clinking as they landed near the rebels. The subsequent twin blasts were gratifying, followed by silence from that quarter. We dashed forward and found their bloodied remains and weapons strewn about. Good. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but might have been only minutes, the shooting inside died down. The remaining rebels were either dead, surrendered, or fled deeper into the cathedral's inner sanctum. The great nave was ours, though at grim cost again. Bodies of friend and foe alike littered the holy ground. A few wounded moaned or called for medics. The guard units were securing entries, preparing for any counterattack. Father Sean limped in through the main doors, his robes tattered, flanked by 2 junior priests. Upon seeing the defiled interior and the casualties, he raised his crozier and shouted, "Purge the darkness with holy fire! Cleanse this sacred place of the heretic's stench!" I suspect he would have lit the whole building ablaze if given the chance, but for now he moved to comfort a dying soldier, giving last rites among the destruction. Hark reloaded his shotgun and approached a group of us. "Form up. The rebel command group should be in the A-piece behind the altar. We finish this now," he ordered. His voice was steely, but I detected fatigue behind it. Brock hefted a captured auto-pistol in one hand, his last gun lost at some point, and gave a feral grin. "Time to cut the head off these snakes." Leaf stuck close to me, quiet but determined. As we moved cautiously toward the altar area at the far end, that uneasy feeling in me grew. The crimson glow I'd glimpsed earlier was stronger now, flickering from behind the ornate altar. The air smelled wrong, a mix of ozone, sulfur, and something sweetly rotten that turned my stomach. We advanced up a short flight of steps onto the sanctum. There, in the broad, semicircular apse, a nightmarish scene awaited. The rebel leader, a portly, richly dressed governor or cardinal by the look of his gilded and now blood-spattered robes, stood before the grand altar. His eyes were wild with zeal, arms raised high. In one hand he held a massive, ancient tome bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. In his other, a curved sacrificial dagger that glistened with fresh blood. And at his feet, in a crude circle drawn in blood on the marble floor, were bodies, several of them still and lifeless, arranged in some ritual pattern. The air shimmered with unnatural energy above that circle, a nausea-inducing distortion in reality. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were a handful of equally deranged-looking cultists, likely the inner circle. They wore tattered remnants of PDF uniforms, combined with bizarre occult symbols painted on their flesh or armor. One I recognized as a former high-ranking officer, his face twisted by either madness or some minor mutation, as a stubby horn protruded from his brow. They were chanting in unison, a guttural litany in a language I did not understand but which set my teeth on edge. It sounded like metal scraping glass and screams in one. Between us and them stood a final line of protection, a pair of traitor-heavy infantry wielding bulky chain axes and crude improvised shields, perhaps bodyguards. And, Emperor save us, an Astartes? No, thankfully not a true space marine. But I saw with horror a tall figure in warped, piecemeal power armor, likely looted from a fallen Adeptus Astartes or built from scraps, standing near the altar. His helmet was off, revealing a bald, pallid head etched with scarred runes. Some renegade champion or aspirant, perhaps. A huge chainsword rested on his shoulder and a bolt pistol in the other hand. If he had been a real Chaos Space Marine, we would all be dead already, but he moved with the confidence of one who had some genetic or sorceress enhancement beyond a normal man, possibly one of those traitor god who receive blessings from the dark gods. This was a far cry from the regular rebels we'd been fighting. This was outright heresy manifest. We hesitated momentarily at the sight, and in that moment the ritual seemed to reach its climax. The governor figure bellowed an infernal phrase from his blasphemous tome, raising it high. The blood circle on the floor erupted in flame, sickly green and purple flames that danced without heat. The veil of reality tore open above it, with an audible rip like fabric sundered by claws. A wave of nauseating energy washed over us. Several of my comrades cried out or reeled. Leif nearly fell to his knees, clutching his head in agony. I felt a horrible pressure inside my skull and a coldness in my bones that made my teeth chatter uncontrollably. From the tear in the air, something began to emerge. At first, it was just darkness and an unbearable stench, like a butcher's heap left to rot. Then a clawed, red-skinned hand, impossibly large, groped through the rift. It clenched and pulled, widening the tear with brute force. A horned head followed, bestial and angry, eyes burning like coals, jaw filled with fangs. A towering demon of the warp was forcing its way into our reality, invited by the blood sacrifice and the cult's foul chants. "A demon! They've summoned a daemon!" someone screamed in terror, a cry taken up by a few others. This was beyond any battle we had fought. This was the stuff of nightmare and legend, the kind of foe that ordinary men could not hope to stand against. Father Sean, who had approached behind us, raised his aquila and shouted, "Stand firm! Do not falter! It is but a test of faith!" His strong voice echoed, but I heard the quaver in it. Even he must have been terrified. Sergeant Hark, Emperor bless him, did not run. Instead, he roared, "Kill the summoner! Kill them all! Now!" He leveled his shotgun and fired at the governor, performing the ritual. The slug pinged harmlessly off some invisible barrier, inches from the cult leader. A shimmering shield of warp energy, no doubt granted by the ritual's power. Brock, of all people, took initiative. With an insane war cry, he charged straight at the newly materializing demon, firing his auto pistol futilely. The towering fiend had only half emerged, torso and one arm through the rift, legs still obscured by warp glow, when Brock came at it. The thing's eyes fixed on the charging convict, and it grinned with malevolent delight. Brock might as well have been an insect attacking a gull. The demon's free claw lashed out quicker than something that massive should move. It swatted Brack aside like a toy. I saw his body fly across the apse and smash into a column with bone-crunching force. He dropped to the floor limp. Whether he died on impact or was just knocked out, I didn't know. But for the moment, Brack was out of the fight. The two bodyguard brutes advanced on us, chain axes revving. Our group opened fire. Las and auto-gun rounds peppered them. One went down under concentrated fire, his torso chewed up by shots. The second reached our line and swung his roaring axe into a nearby convict, cleaving him nearly in half before a shotgun blast from Hawk blew out the brute's kneecap, sending him toppling. Several of us piled on to finish him with point-blank shots and stabs. The renegade in makeshift power armor, the champion, raised his bolt pistol and fired into our midst. The bolt shells blew apart two men near me in gory explosions. Then the pistol clicked empty. With a snarl, the hulking traitor tossed it aside and charged with his enormous chainsword, meeting a couple of regular guardsmen who tried to bayonet him. He bisected one with a single sweep of the roaring blade, then backhanded the other across the throat, nearly decapitating him. This was too much. Fear was rapidly overtaking the penal troops. A few convicts turned and ran, bolting back toward the nave, sanity overcome by terror. "Come back, cowards!" Hawk shouted, but to no avail. I saw him fumble for the detonator control on his belt, fury in his eyes at the sight of retreat. Before he could trigger it, the demon roared, a sound that shook the very stones, and lunged fully through the portal into reality. It was a greater demon of Khorne by the look of it, one of the blood god's lieutenants. Tall as a sentinel walker, its skin was blood red and brass adornments clung to its muscled form. Great black horns curved from its head, and burning blood drooled from its fanged maw. In its taloned grip coalesced a cruel-looking whip of braided spines and a massive sword wreathed in hellfire. The instant the beast landed on the marble floor, it swung its flaming sword in a wide arc. The blade sheared through two unlucky penal troopers who were frozen in shock, cutting them cleanly in half at the waist. Their bodies fell apart like sliced fruit. Another man caught the lash of the demon's whip around his torso, the spiked coils biting deep. With a flick, the fiend tore the convict into several chunks, splattering the altar steps with his entrails. At this display of horrific power, something in my mind almost broke. A voice of primal fear screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible. Only the presence of the explosive caller and the knowledge that there was nowhere to run in time held me rooted, albeit trembling. That, and perhaps the Emperor's own courage seeping into me in that dark moment, for without some spark of the divine we were surely lost. Hawk attempted to coordinate a response. "Target the demon. Heavy weapons on it," he shouted into his Vox speed, hoping the guard outside might bring heavy guns to bear. But we were inside a cathedral. A tank or artillery couldn't easily reach here quickly. Our last guns were like pinpricks against this monster. Still, some of us fired. I emptied the rest of my charge pack at it, pockmarking its hide with scorches that only seemed to anger it further. The cultists near the altar continued their chant, sustaining the warp rift which now pulsated behind the demon. It wasn't closing. If anything, it looked to be widening further, unstable energies crackling at its edges. Emperor have mercy. Were more things going to come through? The renegade champion finished gutting another guardsman and turned his attention on Hark, who was issuing orders. With a guttural laugh, the traitor swung his chainsword at our arbitrator. Hark blocked with his shotgun, the blade biting into the weapon and tearing it from his grasp. Hawk stumbled back, drawing his sidearm last pistol. The champion kicked him in the chest, sending Hawk sprawling hard on the steps, knocking the wind out of him. The champion raised his chainsword high to deliver the killing blow. Leaf jumped between them. I couldn't believe it. Leaf, our quiet, fearful life, threw himself in front of the descending chainsword with only his bayonet-fixed lasgun. He caught the chainsword with the length of his rifle, attempting to parry. The whirring teeth bit into the weapon's barrel, sparks flying. With a screech, the chainsword cleaved through the gun and into Leif's shoulder. He cried out in pain as the blade ground into his flesh, but his act had deflected the strike enough that Hawk was spared immediate death. Seizing the moment, I lunged at the champion from the side. With a shout, I slammed a crack grenade onto his torso and kicked off backwards as hard as I could. The adhesive on the grenade clutched to his breastplate. His eyes widened in surprise as he glanced down. I landed and rolled behind a chunk of marble as the grenade went off. The blast was fierce. Crack grenades concentrate their explosive force. It blew a jagged hole clear through the traitor's chest, spraying corrupted organs and ceramide shards in all directions. When I looked up, I saw the champion wavering, a gaping wound where his sternum had been. Incredibly, he was still on his feet for a second, perhaps on sheer will. He coughed blood, tried to raise his chainsword again, but his strength gave out and he toppled with a thunderous crash of metal. My relief was short-lived. The demon remained, and it was furious. It focused its malevolent gaze on me. I think my grenade's explosion finally got its full attention. Its fanged maw twisted into a hideous grin as it realized I had killed its champion and dared injure it with my puny weapons. I met its hellish eyes and felt pure terror. "Mortal insect!" it snarled, voice like an avalanche. It began to stride directly toward my position, hooves cracking the marble floor with each step. I scrambled backward, only to collide with the altar rail behind me. I had nowhere further to go. Around me, whatever was left of our force was in tatters. A few convicts and soldiers were either dead, fleeing, or cowering behind cover. Father Scholn had stepped forward, flanked by his acolytes, boldly reciting an exorcism. "Begone, abomination! In the name of the God Emperor, I cast you back into the void." His strong voice boomed, but the demon did not seem impressed by mere words. It laughed, a horrid grating sound. It flicked its whip toward the source of the voice. The barbed lash shot out and coiled around one of the junior preachers, the one just beside Father Scholn. The young man had time for a single scream before the demon yanked the whip, and he was torn into quarters in a splatter of gore. Scholn faltered at the spray of his disciple's blood, yet still he stood, raising his holy symbol high. The fiend pressed on, now nearly upon me and the altar, its sword raised, ready to deliver a killing stroke down upon me. I pressed myself against the cold stone of the altar and instinctively raised my arms to cover myself. It was a pathetic, futile gesture, but in that instant of mortal fear I had no other defense. A blur of motion. Father Scholn interposed himself between me and the descending blade, holding aloft the Aquila icon in both hands as if to ward off the demon. "The Emperor protects!" Scholn roared defiantly. The demon's hellblade met the Aquila in a flash of blinding golden sparks. For one miraculous second, it seemed the Aquila, a symbol of the Emperor's will, actually halted the unholy weapon midair, inches from the priest's face. The demon itself looked taken aback, exerting force yet unable to push through. Scholn's eyes blazed with righteous fury as he pushed back, chanting a prayer of banishment. The moment didn't last. With a snarl, the demon channeled its might, and the sword sheared through the holy icon with a shriek of rending metal. The shattered pieces of the Aquila fell from Scholn's hands. The blade continued down and cleaved the valiant priest from collarbone to hip in a single devastating cut. Sean gasped, a strangled sound, as blood gushed and his body fell in two halves at the monster's feet. "No!" I shouted, horror mixing with despair. Father Sean had bought me a heartbeat of time with his life, but now the towering creature loomed over me, no obstacles left. My hand brushed something on the altar beside me, the heavy ceremonial brass candelabra, still burning with candles lit perhaps by the cult for their ritual. Without thinking, I seized it. The thing was weighty, perhaps 20 or 30 pounds of ornate metal. With a desperate cry, I swung it with all my might at the demon's face. The makeshift bludgeon connected with a resounding gong, hitting the beast square on the jaw. To my shock, it actually staggered the demon a half step, and a couple of its fangs broke off from the force, clattering to the floor. The demon shook its head, momentarily stunned more from surprise than injury. It fixed me with its burning eyes, and now its expression promised a slow, inventive dismemberment. "Wretch," it growled, "you will suffer infinite agonies for that." I scrambled back, now half crawling along the far side of the altar. My mind raced, adrenaline spiking at maximum. I knew I had only seconds to live unless I did something. My last gun was spent, my grenades were gone. My vision darted around wildly and fell upon a shape on the ground a few feet away, one of the fallen human bombs. He'd charged in earlier alongside us, but been cut down by gunfire before detonating. His corpse lay against a column, and strapped to his chest was still the bomb harness, 6 or 7 cylinders of high explosive linked together. In that instant, a mad plan took form, the kind of plan a sane man wouldn't even consider. But I was far past sanity's border. With the demon stalking toward me around the altar, I sprinted the short distance to the corpse of the bomber. The demon likely assumed I was trying to flee, and it took its time, savoring the inevitability of my demise. That arrogance gave me the precious seconds needed. I dropped my last gun and grabbed at the bomb harness. The activation switch was a pull cord hanging from it. Gritting my teeth, I yanked the harness free from the dead man's body and slung it over my own torso, fastening the strap as best I could with trembling fingers. It was like putting on a suicide vest, a vest I intended to immediately use. The demon rounded the altar, coming back into view to finish me off. It saw what I was doing and hesitated, perhaps unfamiliar with the device but sensing a threat. I stood up straight to face the monster, the weight of the explosives heavy on my chest, heart hammering beneath them. There was nowhere to run now, nothing left to do but see this through. I spared a glance sideways and saw Leif collapsed on the ground not far off, badly wounded from the champion's chainsword but still alive. He was looking at me with shock and comprehension dawning in his eyes. Blood bubbled on his lips. He tried to say something, but I couldn't hear. His eyes, though, they spoke both fear and pride at once. Nearby, I saw Arbitrator Hark, injured but propped on one arm, staring at me too. He looked completely baffled by what I was about to do. The demon, realizing my intent, bellowed, "You dare! You dare!" It rushed forward, not to flee, but to try to cut me down before I could act, anger overriding caution. I met its charge with one of my own. Let it not be said that Jaren the coward died cowering. I rushed toward the towering abomination head-on, hands on the bomb's detonator cord. The creature swung its fiery sword in a horizontal sweep meant to bisect me as I came. I ducked under the blade, feeling the furnace heat sear the hair on my head, and closed the last few steps. Now I was right up against the demon's towering form, inside the reach of its sword. With a half-surprised grunt, the demon dropped its sword, which dissolved into smoke as it left its grasp, and seized me in its massive claws, one on each side of my ribcage. Agony lanced through me as its talons pierced my flak vest and dug into flesh, likely puncturing a lung. It lifted me off the ground effortlessly, bringing me eye to eye with its horned, bestial face. I choked a scream, blood filling my mouth. It squeezed slowly, deliberately, wanting to crush the life out of me, to savor the kill. My vision swam from pain, but my right hand still clutched the detonator cord in a death grip. I mustered every ounce of strength and conviction left in my broken body. Summoning a voice I didn't know I had, I hissed through my bloodied teeth at the fiend. "Only in death does duty end. See you in hell, monster." Then I pulled the cord. A brilliant white light and searing heat consumed me. The world dissolved in an instant of thunder. I feel light. Is this death? There is pain, but it's far away now, like an echo. I see nothing but brightness behind my eyes. Did it work? Emperor, did I do it? I can't turn my head, can't feel my limbs. But I swear I hear something, screams fading, a furious roar of a demon undone, perhaps. There is a rushing sound in my ears, like a great wind, or maybe just the blood surging in my head one final time. My thoughts drift. Am I afraid? Strangely, no, not anymore. I think of Leaf, the kid who wanted to do right by the Emperor. I think of Brack, foolish and violent, meeting a meaningless end. I think of Father Sean, who truly believed redemption was at hand. And I think of myself, a deserter, a coward who finally found something worth giving his life for at the very end. A warmth spreads through what remains of me. Perhaps it is the Emperor's embrace, or maybe just my failing senses. But I'd like to believe, just for this moment, that he is here, that he watched it all and sees me now. I gave my life in service, in sacrifice. Is it enough? Will the Emperor forgive my sins? I'd like to think so. After all, only in death could my crimes be forgiven. And now that death is here. My duty is done. My name was Jaren once. I was a Penal Legionnaire of the Imperial Guard. And this was my last chance at redemption. If the Emperor is listening, I hope it's enough. Just before all goes dark, I imagine I see Mara's face one last time, gentle and loving, like an angel watching over me as I fade. Perhaps it's only a dream, or perhaps the Emperor sending comfort in my final moments. Either way, I welcome the darkness now.